Morning all, let's continue our look at Garry Kasparov versus the Deep Blue Computer of 1997. So this was the rematch. The first match was in 1996, which Kasparov won 4-2. Okay, so this rematch, in which Kasparov nicknamed his computer Deeper Blue, quite amusingly, it was just a nickname, he kicked off the first game with the white pieces with knight f3. Okay, so Richard Reti's opening, the leading hypermodernist around Nimzovich's time, the rise of the hypermoderns, and he plays it in very hypermodern style. He first fianchettos his king's bishop. Deep Blue ventures bishop g4 here, and now the queen's bishop is also prepared to be fianchettoed. So we're going to get a crossfire across two different diagonals, two different colour complexes. So knight d7, bishop b2. This system, the double fianchetto, had been used against Anatoly Karpov in a key last game, which Kasparov had to beat Karpov to retain his title. Very, very dramatic. So he has played this kind of double fianchetto before. So knight gf6, after castle c6, and it looks as though granite is being set up against the g2 bishop, but in the process the dart squares for the dart square bishop are still effective. d3, bishop d6, now knight bd2, and it looks like later e4 could be prepared, and often it's prepared with queen e1 to avoid a pin, and then e4 will be given a potential tempo game threat of e5 in some cases. After castles h3, kicking the bishop, and now actually we see an interesting delayed kind of move, just e3 here, like a waiting move to see what the computer will do here. So not committing even to queen e1, so that's kind of curious, keeping a lot of options open. h6 is played, and after this h6 now Kasparov feels it's right to play queen e1 here. So it looks as though this central thrust now is really on the cards. h6 has induced a subtle weakness, really, making this plan a little bit more effective. By going the slower route, with h6 there, you could imagine if e5 from black, f5 would be weakened. A knight on f5, you imagine a knight on f5, because of h6, g6 is going to be more difficult to play. So this slight delay of playing queen e1 has reaped this kind of weakness of f5 potentially. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind here. So after queen a5, okay, that's a typical kind of computer move. It seems fairly pointless to do with the queen, but it's got some tactical threats potentially, like bishop a3. So it has got some strategic undertone. If the computer can get rid of this dark square bishop, then the crossfire is going to be reduced. White would like to keep this bishop ideally, because it's pointing also against the king. So he plays actually a3, which stops any bishop a3. Bishop c7 now is played. And now again, not e4 here, but actually another weakness provoker is played. Knight h4, believe it or not. It's provoking g5, and with g5, of course, that's an open invitation later to open lines, and if g5 is played, you know, horrendously, the diagonal is also going to be emphasized. From a human point of view, g5 is an undesirable move in over 90% of cases, really, in a game. But you've always got to investigate like the 10%, because sometimes g5 is a winning move. But the computer plays g5 here, so we see, you know, slight emphasis on the diagonal, weaknesses created on f6 and h6, and that sets an undertone later for potentially powerful moves to celebrate this fact. But also, you can imagine the potential for isolated pawns is also increased. If black loses this pawn, then we have some isolated pawns as well. So g5 from a number of angles is quite committal. So what has the computer got in mind with this? Well, the knight retreats here, and now e5. Okay, and now finally white plays e4, and he's really secured that f5 square potentially. But of course, how can white get a knight to f5? g5 at least has ruled out knight h4, but it's a pretty crude way of ruling that out with some consequences on this diagonal potentially. But there's another route to get to f5, a slow route again. You can imagine if the queen moves somewhere, the rook moves, we would have this knight maneuver to f5, a slow knight maneuver to exploit that f5 square. So these little seeds of destruction, starting with white's e3 provoking h6 and now this g5, has created a very committed pawn structure, probably above the horizon depth of calculation for Deep Blue at the time. I think modern engines maybe have better evaluation functions and wouldn't like commit to this unless there's a really tangible gain. Okay, rook fe8, and we see now knight h2, and it looks as though potentially f4 now is on the cards. Okay, and this queen hasn't clearly moved, so the idea of queen e2 is pinning the knight. So this looks as though the idea of rerouting this is not on the cards at the moment to f5. So after queen b6, now we see a very interesting move, queen c1. Just waiting here. What is black doing here? What is the purpose of this move? Is it potentially going to pounce in some way on this weakened pawn chain over here? Black plays now a5. Now rook e1, finally making way potentially for a knight, either knight, to come and maybe reroute to f5. Bishop d6. And now it's actually the d knight is chosen, not the h knight. That has some advantages. For example, the queen is now seeing g5 and h6, so maybe even later that will be useful. Okay, now the computer plays its first pawn exchange. The first pawn exchange of the game is now played, because otherwise it was like a closed position, which usually is a good recipe for beating computers, or it was, to keep the positions closed, because in closed positions the brute force approach, the if-then move type analysis, is less effectual because there's no hand-to-hand battle. It's all behind the scenes. Does this really open up the position? D takes e4 though. It's only one pawn exchange, and it's the symmetrical pawn structure is of course kept intact here. Bishop c5, the first threat on a soft spot as well. Something to be alarmed about or not. Knight e3, rook ad8 now, and it looks as though if e5 wasn't a problem, then maybe black can also reroute a knight to say d4. That might be quite unpleasant potentially. Knight hf1, and now another weakening kind of move is played here from the computer, g4. Okay, so what is going on here? Well, Kasparov takes on g4. After the knight takes g4, he has the option to play f3, which he takes here. The knight on e3 is supported, so even though there's a battery here, which looks kind of dangerous, it's okay. Knight takes e3, knight takes e3. And we note here, we should note isolated pawns and structural damage generally. Bishop e7. It looks as though the computer is interested in pinning the knight against the queen here, which after king h1 it does. Now, in this position, rook e2 is played, which might have the idea of things like queen g1, and then maybe putting the rook here and then proceeding from there, for example. Okay, or alternatively, maybe just, well, you wouldn't want to use the d file here, so maybe queen e1. Anyway, in this position, the computer plays a4, softening up a bit, maybe the queen side, but after b4 it's not that soft. And now we see a very interesting move. If the knight can be unpinned, as mentioned, maybe for example queen e1, queen g1, there is a basic purpose of that for knight f5, because this pin is holding up knight f5. If knight f5 is played, then there's more pressure around black's king, and maybe this bishop can be liberated further with later f4, assuming it's not losing too much material. But in this position, the computer plays a very dynamic move, trying to exploit this pin here. f5. So clearly the knight can't take, so Kasparov takes with the pawn. And then we see the piercing, seemingly piercing e4. So it looks as though the rook, the bishops are all pointing at sensitive squares in white's position. But what about this diagonal? And what about this pawn sack? Does it have consequence for black? Well, here, what can white play without crumbling, basically? If he plays g4, it looks as though this is going to start crumbling, tumbling down this position. After e takes, for example, then maybe bishop takes looks kind of painful, attacking the queen, and something like this, and black will be a piece up. So, okay, white's got to be careful. We'll engine check after. I don't want to spoil the flow here by going into detailed variations or checking with an engine here at this point. In the second pass through the game, we'll look more forensically at this. But after e4, there's an interesting option which Kasparov chooses, which is actually a very powerful option as well. So how does white solve all this pressure, all these problems of the pressure of these bishops raking down these two diagonals? If I give you 10 seconds, or you may want to pause the video, what would you play here as white, starting from now? Okay, what have we seen a lot on this channel? Positional sacrifices, and exchange sack in particular with f4 is now invited. f4, so there's a couple of options you might think definitely need to be investigated. Bishop takes e2, of course, and bishop takes f4 maybe as well to investigate. Let's check out maybe bishop f4 after in the second pass through the game. Here bishop takes e2. Okay, so Kasparov takes on g5, so an exchange sacrifice. And it looks like a very logically justified one, because black has not got a dark squared bishop. This dark squared bishop is running riot down the whole diagonal, and it's got potential coordination with queen and knight. And also these pawns can act as attacking resources as well, as Kasparov notes many times that pawns around the opponent's king can often be like an extra piece. So knight e5 here, and a pawn is pushed to g6. You might wonder, well, hold on, why didn't black take on g5? It is a good question, and one we should really investigate maybe in the second pass through the game. There are a number of options here, it seems. So okay, so in the game, knight e5, g6, holding on and creating two connected pass pawns around the king. So there's an unchallenged bishop. Okay, but still, bishop f3. How does Kasparov get rid of this horrible pressure he's under. Bishop c3 secures the second rank a little bit. Queen b5 looks as though there's an invasion with queen e2 planned. And against this, Kasparov offers the exchange of queens. And of course, often with simplification, pass pawns gain in strength. That's a fundamental kind of human pattern we deduce, that often towards the end game, king safety often becomes less relevant. The king needs to be more active in endgames, and pass pawns gain strength. So are these two connected pass pawns gaining strength here? Queen takes f1, rook takes f1. Now after h5 is played, Kasparov unpins here his bishop with king g1. King f8. Okay. And it looks as though potentially there's an option of bishop e5 here, but maybe as well as rook e5, there's bishop g2 to consider. So Kasparov, for the moment, he plays actually bishop h3. He's keeping both bishops on the board. b5, and now he brings his king to f2. King g7, which goes straight into a pin. You might think that's a remarkably strange move to play king g7. Why would black want to set up a pin here? Okay, well, it looks as though in this position these two pass pawns, there might be an option at some point, if there wasn't a rook d2 check, at some point of f6 being on the cards. Okay, so let's bear that in mind anyway. King g7, going straight into the pin, which Kasparov now exploits that pin by playing g4, which he can afford to do. And on brief engine inspection earlier, this next move looks like a howler, but it's a bad position for black. Black is going quite downhill now, because g5 will force through potentially, or make this pawn mass stronger at least, for a potential f6 at the right time, possibly. So king h6 is played, but rook g1 is again renewed as a kind of possibility. And now deep blue takes on g4, so more simplification now. Bishop takes g4, but again, with this simplification, the power of the passed pawns is increasing, and this is actually simplifying now into a completely hopeless position for the computer. After rook takes g4, these pawns are really, really powerful. Black's going to have to give up material soon. Okay, so we see now rook d5 and f6 is okay, supported by the bishop. In this position now, on move 44, the computer played rook d1, and I was reading some notes. There's some notes on Wiki about this match. Apparently, a psychologist has attributed this to giving Kasparov some anxiety why the computer would play this move, as though it had some higher intelligence behind it. It turned out that this may have been a bug. Maybe the Deep Blue software did have a few bugs. It's not like it's got the exposure, the market exposure of a modern engine, which many thousands of chess enthusiasts have got to get rid of bugs, and you get new version releases. This was a specialist system. Maybe this was a bug, but it seems a hopeless position anyway. And in fact, after G7, Deep Blue, the team resigned here. It looks completely hopeless because F7 looks unstoppable. Now let's try and do some clinical analysis here with our engine friend Houdini 2.0. So here in this final position, it looks hopeless. I mean, if check, we can play here. If the rook moves back, okay, we just play f7, and we're queening a pawn here, or winning a rook. That's going to be okay, just to win a rook. End of game. So it is pretty hopeless. There's no way really of stopping these pawns. Okay, let's go with Rook D5 as an example. Is there a way to go wrong? There is a way to go wrong with f7 here, because of the check winning the pawn there. But instead of that, just King E2, so renewing the threat of f7. Alright, let's imagine Rook f5 then as a try. Check. Now we've got here in this position Rook h8. The passed pawns have got a lust to expand, as Fisher would say. So here, how can this be saved? It can't. If King f7, we just take, and then we queen. So it's fairly hopeless for the connected passed pawns. They're triumphing here, triumphing in the variations. So Rook D1 though gave Kasparov anxiety for the next game, which is video annotated on the channel. But let's go back to this. The Roy Lopez in the next game caused a lot of controversy, basically, in this match. But let's check out this game again for some critical moments. So the double fianchetto hypermoderns. The hypermoderns would be proud that their ideology is being used to defeat the strongest computer in 1997. So E3, deliberately slow path to playing for E4, reaps a huge benefit of provoking H6. But mind you, maybe the computer is kind of wary about the bishop, not wanting to lose the bishop. Giving it an option of going back to H7. Maybe it was factored in, if you have things like knight h4 chasing the bishop after. So h6 did give also like a retreat square for the bishop for g6 to h7. But queen e1, so we've got this idea of playing for e4. But again, it was played very, very slowly and cautiously, and only in fact when black had played e5. So when black deprived itself of the e5 square for a piece, basically, and we definitely had a locked pawn situation. So this knight h4, Petrosian-esque again, just provoking more weaknesses, setting the scene for a later powerful positional sacrifice, theoretically based in the weakness of the long diagonal and other weaknesses. So there was a sound justification positionally for the positional sacrifice coming up. So now that black can't use e5 because it's occupied now by a pawn, can't use it by a piece, now the pawn chain is locked against each other, jammed in. Knight h2. Okay, we saw now queen c1. It's a quiet position. If you look at these variations, there's nothing, shouldn't be anything really radically going on here, because it's a very locked, closed position. So d takes e4. Okay, a pawn exchange, but it's still a symmetrical pawn structure. The soft spot issue isn't much of an issue. It's funny, Houdini's giving after g4 now a change in the valuation. It was up to here, it was like liking black a tiny bit on this very brief depth, but it seems g4 maybe was a step too far with pawn moves. It seems white now technically has the advantage, according tiny advantage. We wouldn't really speak of this as an advantage, just more than equality basically now for white after g4. But okay, and now after knight takes g4, in fact bishop takes g4 was preferred. Possibly the preference is to do with knight g4 not being, I don't think knight g4 is an option here because of the pressure on f2. That's pretty nasty. That's the way of getting the pawn structure sliced. Okay, so in the game knight takes g4 and knight takes g4 is an option here because there isn't the huge pressure on f2. So knight e3 now fends off f2, by the way. So okay, Kasparov though didn't choose knight g4. He played the strongest move, it seems, on this brief analysis here, of playing f3. So not minding a knight exchange, and white's advantage seems a bit more pronounced there, approaching almost half a pawn, even though there's a couple of pins set up which seem a bit of a menace. this pin here and potentially this pin here is about to be set up now. After this move it's gone to about equal. I don't know really, but why? Because the queen has to do something surely to get this rook into the game. How does white get the pieces into the game? A4, B4. That seems to be a slight subtle I don't know, something which isn't great. But F5 is very, very committal. If black didn't play F5, alright, let's go with Queen A6. Let's do something with the Queen. Queen E1. Let's say Knight B6. Bishop C1, yes, to challenge that bishop. Knight F5, and here you would imagine visually that this is very attractive achievement. And yes, it should reap some benefit, technically, one would expect. Queen C3. There is pressure on black, but again, it's not really that clear cut. What made this game more clear cut was this F5 now, for white having the advantage, going in materialistically maybe to exploit the pin here, which looks very, very dangerous. So F4 only move basically. G4, as I mentioned, I think this just crumbles white. E takes F3 and it's disaster. I think just bishop takes E3 is a big advantage, or not. Queen E1 is a resource, okay. No, actually there's something stronger then in this position. Just bishop F7. And how does white defend E3? E3 is dropping here. So that's totally a question, okay. So E takes F3, bishop takes F3. Yeah, bishop F7. So in the game, Kasparov plays F4, positional sacrifice. So it's got the undertone positionally that the diagonal's weakened, there's weak squares around the king, and also these pawns are very useful coming up. They gain in strength. Now, I was wondering about bishop takes F4 earlier. So here, okay, let's have a look. G takes F4, it does open the G file. Bishop takes. Now, not Queen G1, apparently that's not the strongest move here. By far. Oh, okay, Queen G1 is strong. Queen D2 though, I think the idea is to get the battery going on the diagonal to exploit those weak and dark squares. Not minding the shock of the knight exposure to the rook. So say Knight F6. Well, that gives up the bishop. So if the bishop moves, hang on, what's going on here? I guess Queen C3. Queen C3 is strong, or even Knight G4 is strong. And then Queen C3, and we have the totally winning. 9, the sky's the limit. Yeah. So that would be very unpleasant, basically, for black's king safety. So black plays bishop takes E2, keeping it about level at the moment. After FG, I was wondering also about HG. So in this position, okay, a knight sack just to get Queen G5 in, either on C4 or D5 will do. So if Knight D5, for example, takes, Queen G5 is a mate in 3. So King F7, Queen G7 always putting the Queen in the way, of course, computer move. So so that would be very crushing, just with Queen G5, black having to give up the Queen to stave off mate. So that's not such a hot idea. Okay, so basically Knight E5 allows Kasparov to keep two connected passed pawns near the opponent's king. Bishop F3. Look at the evaluation now, it's not too bad, it seems. Queen B5. And now after Queen F1, our Houdini here starts to still favour white slightly, but I think the advantages get further pronounced soon with the next set of exchanges. Well, G4. Here it seems H4 would be, according to Houdini, a more determined resistance. in this position. If G5, well, you might think, that is there a threat of F6 because of King G6? Well, King F8, let's see what's going on. Or why King F8? Why not say, with Rook D7 F6, the rooks kind of can't do anything here. If Rook E7 F6, where do we move the rooks? Let's just do a token rook move. Okay, Knight G2 would be powerful here. Just going to take on H4 or something. Okay. So maybe H4 doesn't really save black. So white's advantage is getting absolutely out of control now after Rook G1, but also H5 is apparently strong. But Rook G1, white's advantage is still growing hugely now after HG. So I don't think it really mattered after H4 again. If this Knight G2 resource is really that powerful. Or here, Bishop G2. Okay. So anyway, the simplification now, and white's advantage is phenomenal. It's recognised immediately by Houdini as a nearly winning position. So F6, this isn't mentioned Rook D1, so it does look like some sort of bug occurred. It isn't mentioned as a strong move for maximum resistance, Rook D1 at all. It's not fourth, it's not fifth. It's nowhere to be found, so maybe it was just, you know, a bug. Rook D1. Okay, after G7, finally, okay, the team resigned. The deep blue team resigned. So it was a kind of hypermodern game played by Kasparov, waiting and creating weaknesses through provocation, Petrosian-esque, kind of sitting on the baseline like Petrosian would do, waiting for the opponent to do overstretching or creating weaknesses, and then pouncing later in a Petrosian style, really, to hijack diagonals, exploit weaknesses with this powerful positional exchange sacrifice. So it seems thoroughly based in the positional advantages, concretely based in positional advantages, and the endgame transition just amplified the connected passed pawns, the power of those connected passed pawns. I hope you got something from it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.